What's the big vision? What's the swing for the fences vision here?
The swing for the fences vision is we want to become basically the Shell or Chevron or ExxonMobil, but completely carbon neutral or carbon negative. And we see hydrogen as being the key to that. So when you look at petrochemicals and fuels and sustainable plastics, we see hydrogen as being a key to that and the key feedstock to all those things. Just as oil is the key feedstock to all those things today, we see clean hydrogen as being the key feedstock to all those things 10 years from now.
Caleb, it's great to have you on Next Unicorn. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Sasha. I'm really honored.
I'm really excited about this interview. Before we start, let me just give an introduction about you for everyone else. You are the co-founder of Molten Industries. Molten is commercializing breakthrough technology to produce low-cost, clean hydrogen to decarbonize heavy industrial sectors such as steel, fertilizer, fuels, and plastics. You attended UC Berkeley for your bachelor's and then graduated from Stanford with a PhD in materials science and engineering. After graduating, you moved to Germany and became a venture capitalist in Munich, working with UVC Partners, an early stage deep tech VC firm. You eventually moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area to co-found Molten Industries. Recently, you were named a 2023 Forbes 30 Under 30 in the energy category. You and your co-founder, Kevin Bush, were also recently named as two of Bill Gates' 2022 Breakthrough Energy Fellows. That's very impressive. I want to dive in this interview to your personal career path, the company, the sector, some learnings you've had about being a startup founder and a VC, and then a little lightning round at the end. First, just tell me briefly, but with a little more color and texture than normal, a little about your personal career journey. Like, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah. So, I mean, you ticked off a lot of the kind of the highlights, resume points, I guess. Barely skated in with the Forbes 30 Under 30 at the age of 29. So that's a funny one there. But basically grew up in California on a ranch, actually. So my parents are both teachers, but as a family hobby, we had cattle, chickens and goats as well. And I'm going to come back to this point later because it pertains to what we're doing at Molten. But then, as you mentioned, went to UC Berkeley for mechanical engineering. And then actually between my time at Berkeley and Stanford, I spent a year in India working with a company there that was building air purifiers. And that's actually when I saw for the first time in my life pretty dramatic harmful effects of air pollution from industrial sectors. And so, I mean, I think a big thing that everyone talks about is CO2, which we can't really see and is not super harmful in small quantities. But there's also harmful things like particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, SOx, NOx, and those things really impact people's health. And so we were building air purifiers to try to improve people's lives. And that's really when I got into and started feeling a passion for climate tech and clean energy. And so when I went back to Stanford, decided to spend my time at Stanford researching new materials for solar and researched really high efficiency perovskite on silicon tandems, which are just high efficiency solar cells to convert sunlight into electricity. And then actually pivoted away from solar into hydrogen to start this startup after a brief stint in venture capital, like you mentioned. And excited to share more about what came of that pivot, why I did that, why I was interested in that. But I think that's a little bit more color into how I came about doing this.
Was there anything unexpected about your career path? And if so, what was that?
I mean, there's a lot of unexpected things. I mean, hindsight is 2020, but I mean, when I was back at Berkeley, I never thought in a million years that I was going to do grad school, as a perfect example. So went into Cal, was going to get my bachelor's and then go work in engineering. I had interned a couple different times at Apple, did a co-op there, and just thought I was going to work at Apple and live a great life as a tech Apple person in Silicon Valley and drive around my Porsche or Tesla or whatever it was going to be. But actually, right before graduating, and it was literally the semester I was going to graduate from Berkeley, my academic advisor at the time pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Caleb, have you thought about doing grad school?" I said, "Absolutely not. I'm getting out of here to make money, and I don't want to spend more money on school," because I was trying to put myself through school. And he said, "Well, you should look into PhDs because you don't have to pay for them." And that was completely a new concept to me. I had no idea that you could go to grad school and have that actually paid for you. He was like, "Yeah, you can go to a school like Stanford or Berkeley or any of these amazing schools. You don't have to pay a dime. They'll actually pay you a stipend, and you get to do research." And I thought that was incredibly interesting. And so I decided to apply, ended up getting into Stanford, and I guess the rest is history. But that was a big unexpected twist, which looking back, I mean, seems, I guess, kind of obvious in my career path. But at the time, it was just a total swing from left field. So yeah, really happy that I did that, by the way. And I recommend, and for anyone out there that thinks grad school, you have to pay for it. STEM PhDs, you don't have to pay for. They're free. So go get them.
Okay. A plug for STEM PhDs. There you go. It sounds like you were very focused on high efficiency solar. How did that interest shift to away from solar toward hydrogen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my co-founder and I, Kevin Bush, we both did our PhDs together at Stanford. We were working in the lab together, spending lots of late nights in the lab, building these high efficiency solar cells. And after the PhD, Kevin went and actually founded a startup in that space, building high efficiency solar cells. I went and worked in venture capital. And during the pandemic, everyone had tons of time, and we started brainstorming together on what do we see as, ideas that are 10 to 15 years out. So let's put ourselves 10 to 15 years down the road. What do we think is going to be true of the world? And what are the things that we think we can impact the most today that will be really important 10 to 15 years from now? And specifically, I think if I put myself 10 to 15 years in the future, I believe in a future where the majority of the grid is going to be non-carbon energy sources. So solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, hydro, battery storage. So I think the electric grid will largely be a solved problem. I think that a lot of things that we're able to electrify, passenger vehicles, things like heating, small scale heating with heat pumps. I think a lot of those will be well on their way to electrification. But I think there's going to be things like heavy industry, so steel, cement, things in transportation that are difficult to electrify. So long haul shipping, flight, heavy shipping through maritime, so maritime shipping, that I think existing solutions are going to be very difficult to solve when you look at the way solutions are shaping up today to decarbonize those sectors. And that's where we started brainstorming and playing around. And what we saw that was really interesting is that when you look at all these different sectors, solutions to these sectors often have hydrogen as somewhat of a universal thread uniting them. So steel, as an example, right now is primarily made using coal. And one of the primary solutions to replace coal in the steel sector is to use hydrogen instead. But this requires readily abundant, low cost, clean hydrogen. Similarly, when you look at chemicals, so the entire chemical industry, incredibly hard to decarbonize. And a lot of the primary chemicals that we use, so petrochemicals that come from oils, things that make plastics or fuels, they're all hydrocarbons. So they're atoms and molecules that are made up of hydrogen and carbon bonded together in different form factors. And so if you think, let's say 15 years in the future, where we're trying to completely wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, you can put yourself in a situation where you can get all of your carbon potentially from biosources or things like CO2 from the sky. And then you need to add hydrogen to that in the right amount to make all of these different things. So sustainable plastics, sustainable fuels, sustainable chemicals, all of them are just basically different makeups and ratios of hydrogen and carbon. And so we saw hydrogen as being this real key to these entire industry sectors. And so that's why we started looking into it, and more later on why we chose methane pyrolysis, what we're doing at Molten. But yeah, that was the kind of the interest in hydrogen specifically.
Cool. Let's dig in a little more to Molten and what you do exactly, what the vision is, and what the problem you're solving is. And without being too overly technical, I don't think many of our listeners are super science oriented in this area.
Yeah. So Molten, we're developing technology to produce the world's lowest cost, cleanest hydrogen. Hydrogen is specifically an element that's used as a chemical ingredient. And like I mentioned before, can be used to make things like steel, but can also be used to make things like fertilizer, fuels. So sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable diesel, sustainable gasoline, all of that can be made using hydrogen. And really what we're doing is trying to commercialize a breakthrough way of producing hydrogen that doesn't exist today. So hydrogen today is actually already a huge market. It's a $100 billion market globally, and it's used primarily for the chemical industry. But the way that hydrogen's made today emits 10 tons of CO2 for every ton of hydrogen. So it's an extremely dirty process from a climate and a CO2 carbon neutrality standpoint. And so we said, what are the things that can decarbonize the way that hydrogen's produced today? And so we're taking methane, which can either be natural gas, so fossil methane, or it can be from bio-based sources. So remember, I grew up on a ranch. Things like cattle emit a lot of methane. And so we've actually gone back to my hometown and talked to a lot of my former friends who are now running and operating dairy farms to say, how can we take the methane that you are producing, put it into our process and decarbonize it, take the carbon out to produce clean hydrogen. And so that's what we're doing with a proprietary technology that Kevin and I actually invented and built first in Kevin's garage at Stanford, taking methane up to temperatures above 1,000 Celsius to crack it into solid carbon and clean hydrogen.
It sounds like that is a huge market and a huge area. Is it necessary early on to choose certain use cases for this kind of technology, or is it sort of a universal issue?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think a difficult question.
Okay.
I would say where we're at right now is 100% focus on product and scaling our tech. I think it's incredibly clear to us that any of the use cases that we're in, we're going to need to achieve a certain level of reliability, a certain level of energy efficiency, and a certain level of scale that we're not at today, and that we believe we can be at, with development. But that's the primary targets we're trying to hit. They're all technical related right now. And when we start hitting those technical requirements, I think then it's time to go and kind of pinpoint which industry sectors we think are the lowest barrier to entry and the highest returns.
Got it. You mentioned your co-founder. Tell me, how did you and your co-founder meet, and how exactly did you come up with Molten Industries, and how did you get the company off the ground?
Yeah, so we met doing our PhDs at Stanford, studying high efficiency solar panels. Really, spent a lot of late nights in the lab together. Both respected each other as some of the hardest workers and the smartest engineers that we'd ever met. And so that was important because we just developed a mutual friendship and a respect long before Molten was even an idea. And we actually started Molten. I mentioned brainstorming during the pandemic, but the hydrogen thing wasn't our first idea. We went through several different ideas. We looked at direct air capture. We were looking at CO2 mineralization. We were looking at clean cement, and wrote up patents and did a bunch of research for all these ideas. At one point we started a company and kind of shut it back down. We thought it wasn't a good idea. Wrote patents that we abandoned. And basically came to hydrogen using this somewhat it's hard to call it random walk because it wasn't really a random walk. It was very targeted. What do we think is a really cool opportunity? Let's push as hard as we can on that for a couple months and see where it gets us. And then if we hit a wall, let's do something else. But doing that approach from a standpoint of, okay, reading market research, talking to experts in the space. So talking to professors at Stanford, talking to people in our network who are experts in batteries and CO2 capture and hydrogen. And really getting a lot of feedback early on with ideas that we were testing out with these experts, and just bouncing ideas off them and saying, hey, we're thinking of this. Does it seem like a good idea? And so some of the ideas were not good ideas, and we found that out very quickly. And the hydrogen idea we think is a very good idea. So.
Tell me a little about the larger competitive landscape of hydrogen and related technologies, and how is Molten different, and why is Molten's approach what you think is best?
Yeah, so hydrogen, like I mentioned, you can produce hydrogen from a couple different ways. You can produce it from methane. You can also produce it from water electrolysis, where you split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Some of you guys who are listening to this might have done that in your high school chemistry class, where you kind of stick two electrodes in and bubbles come off of water. The unique thing about what we're doing is twofold. So one, we're using 5 to 7 times less energy or clean electricity than producing hydrogen from water. And so that's really important. So we can be extremely energy efficient. And then secondly, we've developed a reactor that does this methane pyrolysis process that we're doing in a way that's extremely reliable, and literally doesn't clog. So this is kind of silly, but the primary barrier to methane pyrolysis, which has been around as an idea for a long time, but hasn't been commercialized, is that reactors clog. And it's hard to build reactors that are both energy efficient and don't clog. And we believe that we've done that.
It always comes down to the plumbing, huh?
Yep.
All right. What lessons did you learn from your time working as a VC in Germany, and that you were able to apply to Molten?
Yeah, VC was extremely helpful for getting an understanding of how to look at a market and a space and an opportunity and really evaluate it critically, which was helpful when we were looking at all these different opportunities in cement and direct air capture and CO2 mineralization, and saying, what do we think are things that really are exciting opportunities from this VC lens. I think also in understanding how to scale things. So VCs have a lot of experience and can pattern match a lot in what things good companies do that potentially other companies don't. And so being able to apply some of those things to what we're doing at Molten has been helpful.
Just digging a little deeper for anyone else who might be listening, who's maybe iterating on some startup ideas but hasn't been a VC, hasn't had that experience. What are some top sort of lessons you took that someone else might be able to apply when filtering through potential ideas? What would be the sort of the top tips?
Yeah. So evaluating things from what's the potential market. So is there a large potential market? Is that potential market established and able to be disrupted, or is it new and growing? There's a whole list of questions that VCs think about, particularly when it comes to climate tech, I think, and especially hard tech. So we're building hardware in the climate space. I think there are two things that VCs think about a lot that I think a lot of entrepreneurs potentially miss. And one, is your business immune to policy shifts? Is the first one. Are you reliant on subsidies or things in policy that might be gone in 4 years, in the United States at least? And then two, what are your capital requirements and your time requirements to scale? And so I think those are things that are extremely difficult. And I think there's a lot of good answers and promising routes to that in hardware and climate tech. But I think those are important answers to be able to have good answers for.
All right. So your first financing round came together very quickly in something like 2 or 3 weeks, if I recall correctly. And there was a lot of interest from investors. What tips do you have for other founders that want to pull together a very tight first financing round?
I think it was more like 3 or 4 weeks, but big thanks to you for introducing us to some of those investors. Yeah, Brian Jacobs and the team at Mariah Capital and J4 Ventures as well. I think they've been awesome. Particularly, so things are situational too. So, I mean, this is like you say 2 to 4 week round. We were raising a seed round at the end of 2021, which is like probably one of the hottest times to raise venture capital in the last decade. So there was very little due diligence required because seed is all about market, founders, and the idea, and then a very hot time. So that helped. But in general, we had all of our kind of ducks in a row. So we had everything that we needed from a due diligence standpoint ready to go as soon as we started the fundraise. We contacted and had a list of investors that we wanted to contact, and contacted all of them at the same time and tried to set up meetings as closely within that, like kind of a 1 to 2 week time span as possible. And then we put pressure on investors. So from a VC standpoint, having been a VC, VCs have very little time and they have a bazillion different priorities. And so if you have no time limit for them to make a decision, there's really little intrinsic motivation for them to make a decision. And so the best way to do that is to have a term sheet from another investor where they're going to miss out on an opportunity. But the way to do that we did was just putting a time limit on the round and saying, we're talking to investors for first conversations over this time span. Then we're going to do due diligence over this time span, and we want to come to a closing at this time. And you're either in that time or you're out. So, yeah.
What's your vision for Molten in 5 years and 10 years and beyond? What's the big vision? What's the swing for the fences vision here?
The swing for the fences vision is we want to become basically the Shell or Chevron or ExxonMobil, but completely carbon neutral or carbon negative. And we see hydrogen as being the key to that. So when you look at petrochemicals and fuels and sustainable plastics, we see hydrogen as being a key to that and the key feedstock to all those things. Just as oil is the key feedstock to all those things today, we see clean hydrogen as being the key feedstock to all those things 10 years from now. And so 5 years from now, we want to be operating our first commercial plant and demonstrating the technology at TRL 9 at full scale. And 10 years from now, we want to be operating multiple plants across the globe that are producing hydrogen. And then beyond that, we want to move into downstream sectors. So chemicals, fertilizers, fuels.
All right. Yeah, let's talk more about the sector. How much of the climate change solution does hydrogen need to be, and how much of the solution can it really become? And what's really the potential scale of hydrogen?
Yeah, I think hydrogen I've kind of mentioned this a couple different times. I think it's incredibly important to the entire solution to climate change and getting to net zero. There's actually there's a guy named Michael Liebrick who has this hydrogen ladder, which I think is really useful and what this hydrogen ladder is it defines basically at the top of the ladder are the best use cases for hydrogen. So they're kind of the things that are like, these will not be decarbonized without clean hydrogen. And then at the bottom of the ladder are things that are kind of bad use cases for hydrogen, or there are many other alternatives to these that probably will be cheaper than hydrogen. And so at the bottom, you have things like passenger vehicles, which can be readily electrified with batteries that we have the technology for today. And at the top of the ladder, you have things like ammonia-based fertilizer, methanol, things like steel, a lot of things that are extremely difficult to decarbonize or potentially impossible to decarbonize without clean hydrogen, because it is literally an ingredient to making these things. And if you look at and put together the things that hydrogen is good at decarbonizing, it can make up to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not saying that hydrogen itself will be that entire 30% chunk, but the sectors that it can help decarbonize. So things like shipping, using hydrogen to make clean aviation fuels, using hydrogen to make clean steel, using hydrogen to make clean chemicals, can account for up to 30% of global emissions.
Wow. Okay. And by this point, you must be aware of a lot of climate tech founders and VCs. It's a very quickly growing space. What are your views on the state of climate tech currently, if that isn't too broad of a question? And what do you think currently are some of the most exciting areas of climate tech, other than the type of thing Molten is working
on? I mean, I think it's an extremely exciting time for climate tech right now. I mentioned before, don't be dependent on policy, but the entire policy shift over the last couple of years in Europe, in the United States, and Asia, it's become so, a lot of people have said that there's been so many policy incentives globally that we've reached somewhat of a stable equilibrium, as opposed to an unstable equilibrium, where maybe 10 years ago, if one policy, let's say in the United States, was voted out because of some regime change, that would have pushed things away from this climate tech wave. But now we have so many governments that have lined up to create policy incentives and create goals and targets that we're reaching somewhat of a stable equilibrium for pushing forward action there. And I think that's really helpful to the entire state of climate tech. In research and academia, there's been huge strides. I think there's been a lot of moves with artificial intelligence, which I think is incredibly impactful to climate tech and helping both new technologies scale more quickly, but then also in helping distribute those technologies more effectively, potentially also with electricity and energy savings. There's a lot of really exciting stuff going on there. I specifically, I personally am inclined to think that the areas of industrial decarbonization are the most exciting places in climate tech today, because I think those are the places that, if you look at, EVs and solar and wind, I think those areas have somewhat been heavily mined over the last decades. And I think the areas of industrial decarbonization are going to be the next frontier that we're going to see.
So if it's in speaking of these areas of industrial decarbonization, if you weren't busy with Molten and you were an aspiring climate tech entrepreneur, like some that might be listening, what other areas would you be excited to dig into more and maybe work on that you think are high impact, high potential?
Yeah, there are a lot of potential areas. I get really excited about sustainable fuels. So sustainable aviation fuel, which I would consider to be separate from hydrogen. I get really excited about the progress that's going on in direct air capture, and then also in storing CO2, either underground or in mineralization with rocks. A lot of companies doing rock weathering. So, Heirloom Carbon is one example. Lithus Carbon is another one that's doing enhanced rock weathering. I think those are really exciting areas. Yeah.
All right. I'm excited for the future.
Yeah.
You've been a VC, you're working in climate tech. Is climate tech VC ready to have its heyday? Is this the moment? And if so, why?
I absolutely think this is the moment. And the main reason that I think that is twofold. So one, a lot of the solutions to climate are dependent on relatively cheap, clean electricity, which I believe today at global scale, we finally have achieved to a certain extent. And I think it's getting cheaper. To the extent that it will continue to get cheaper, I think is an unknown. But we've achieved that tipping point there, which I think is really exciting. And then when you just look at VC makes money off of volatility and off of massive change. And we're going through pretty much an entire reindustrialization. And so I think that's a really exciting time to be investing in space.
What challenges do climate tech VCs and founders face that are different than those faced by other types of VCs and founders? And how can those challenges be overcome? I know you mentioned a little bit about policy and sort of the fact that some of these things are very capital intensive. Are there anything else to come to mind in terms of challenges specific to climate tech VC and climate tech startups and how those can be overcome?
Yeah, I think something that I think is challenging to a lot of climate tech products and founders is achieving differentiation or achieving a pretty much premium price product, which I think helps a lot in getting companies off the ground. And some of that is starting to be achievable with things like subsidies, which you need to be careful not to be dependent on. But when you look at, something like, let's say, Google or Facebook, where they're basically creating markets that have never been made before, a lot of climate tech, I think, is replacing existing markets with clean alternatives. And so from a consumer mindset or from a customer mindset, it's a little bit of a different math where you're trying to replace something that they probably already have a solution for a lot of times. Maybe they don't have a solution for a climate neutral aspect of it, but they have a solution for that aspect oftentimes already. It's just, incredibly damaging to the environment and emitting tons of CO2. And so I think that's something that I think climate founders need to be careful for, is finding the pain points that are really felt by the business, that are somewhat existential pain points to customers, which I think a lot of people, and I do believe that this will tip in that direction as we shift towards carbon neutral, that sectors that are still emitting will start to see this as really important and existential threats to their business if they can't decarbonize. But I don't think we're there quite yet, where if you talk to the average executive in steel or cement, would they say that, I can't operate without, climate neutral cement? They wouldn't say that.
But by pain point, do you mean the existential threat of climate change, or do you mean additional types of pain points?
Well, I think I personally think that's a huge pain point, but I guess I would mean immediately relevant business specific pain points, which usually are how decisions are made in a lot of these industries, unfortunately.
What do you think are some of the most unexpected things about climate tech today?
The Inflation Reduction Act, which for listeners who don't know, was a huge legislation passed in late 2022 by the United States government that basically, put in massive policy incentives towards decarbonizing a whole variety of industries, everything from electric vehicles to solar to wind to sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, direct air capture. If you had talked to anyone a week before it passed, anyone in the climate space, they would have said this is never going to happen. And then it passed, and everyone is has been on a perpetual high since then. So that's been great. Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to sort of more of your learnings about being a startup founder. What do you think are some of the most important attributes of a startup that can help make it successful?
Cool. I think moving quickly, having an urgency. I think having a solid founding team that, has founders who have experience in the space or have experience founding. And I think founders who aren't, I personally think, especially in climate tech, when you're facing a lot of potential competition or pushback from really established industries, you have to be unafraid to push really hard against the status quo, against people saying, this is a crazy idea, this is a bad idea. I think that's really important. I think the other ones are just like the general VC aspects. So having an amazing product, talking to customers and knowing your customer extremely well, having an exciting market. Yeah.
What do you think are some of the most important attributes of startup founders that can help make them successful?
I kind of said that in the last one, I guess, but okay. I think being willing to, push ahead, basically not listening to no a lot of times when people say no, I think is really important. Being wise in who to listen to when you're getting advice. So we get advice from, a large group of advisors, and knowing when you go to an advisor, what type of advice to listen to them for. Because sometimes you get advice in, 5 different areas. I guess I'm giving you guys advice right now. So understanding the advice that Caleb is giving you of the advice that I just gave you, what you're going to filter out and say, maybe I'll listen to someone else for this advice, but maybe I'll listen to Caleb for this advice. I think that's actually really important. In general, like persistence, resilience, smarts / ability to learn quickly, and having a doer bias to action attitude. So as a startup founder, when it's just me and Kevin in a garage, if we don't do something, it's never going to happen. So biasing towards doing something rather than not doing something.
What have been some of the most challenging parts of being a founder for you, and how have you overcome them?
I think it's challenging. As a founder, because you have to do all these different things for your company, a lot of times you really don't know what you're doing super well. You're not good at what you're doing. So I'm not an expert at finance of companies, but with the support of our bookkeeper and advisors, I run finance for Molten. And so someday soon, I hope to, trade that off to an experienced CFO who's really good at that. But until then, I'm going to be doing that. And I think that's something that is challenging as a startup founder, is you do a lot of things that you're not good at. And there's someone who would be better at this, but you need to do it anyways.
Also, I might as well ask you, since you were recently a VC for a while, what were some of the most challenging parts of being a VC for you, and how did you overcome those?
I really enjoyed being a VC. I think it's extremely intellectually stimulating and fun. A challenging thing about being a VC particularly is having to say no to a lot of ideas that you think could be really, really good. And I think also being able to say no in a way that, both respects the founder and potentially keeps the door open to investing later, which sounds kind of weird, but that's what a lot of VCs think. The truth is that as a VC, you're pretty much prioritizing opportunities. And so you can only invest in a certain number of startups in a fund. And a lot of times you would like to invest in more than that. but you just can't. And so I think that's the really hard part of being VC, for me at least.
It seems like I totally agree with you on those points, but I feel like so few people are good at saying no in a respectful way. That's almost seems like the time spent saying no should be should take longer and be more carefully done than the time spent saying yes. Seems like keeping those doors open and those connections are so important, and being really respectful of people's intelligence and inspiration and hard work, regardless of whether they make it into the small percentage of investment that are correct for that firm. What are some ways you learned about saying no in that kind of way and keeping those connections open, doing that in the best practices?
Yeah, I think at UVC, we had a philosophy to always give a startup an answer. So never kind of ghost a startup or a founder, which I think is probably the worst way to say no. Even just saying no is better than ghosting. At UVC, we also were really keen on wanting to give some sort of constructive feedback or reason why we said no, which I think it's challenging as a VC to do that, because you might be wrong, and as a VC, chances are pretty good that you're wrong when you're saying no sometimes. So being able to say that in a way that both is saying, this is our take, but is not necessarily, truth. So take this as a data point, but don't take this as like the truth. I think is important. And then, just doing it in a way that it understands. And I think when you look back at the history of VC, often the most successful VC startups were said no to many, many, many times. And so it just keeping that in the back of your mind as a VC lets you know that it just tells you that you need to be careful when you're having those conversations.
What's something you wish you had known before founding a startup? Something that's not shared enough?
I think this relates back to the idea of you can't be good at everything and you have to do things that you're bad at. But I think similarly, pretty much, everything that we have and know as a civilization was made by ordinary people like you and me. And those ordinary people just went out, learned things, experimented with things, tried things, failed, succeeded. And they were not, people are brilliant and they're good at different things, but I think they were probably a lot more normal than we care to let on. And I think that's something that I think early on in my time as a founder versus later on in my time as a founder, I've gotten to realize more and more as I've spoken to more and more founders who I have seen as being somewhat like, wow, they're super successful and kind of seem otherworldly or like way beyond me, and realizing they're just normal people and they've started out just like you and me. So
before we move on to the lightning round, is there anything else you'd like to say about hydrogen, climate tech, VC, startups, Molten, or anything else that we haven't talked about yet?
We're hiring at Molten for chemical engineers and mechanical engineers, and we will be hiring for those roles over the next year. So if you are an amazing mechanical or chemical engineer, or you have a friend who's an amazing mechanical or chemical engineer, send them our way. And then the last, I thought about this like 2 minutes ago of things that I think are really interesting in climate tech. There's this whole realm of climate tech called adaptation. So a lot of climate tech thus far has been around mitigation. So how do we, or prevention, how do we prevent climate change? How do we change these industries, stop emitting CO2. But there's a lot of people that are now starting to look at how do we change and adapt as humans as climate change occurs or might occur. Drought tolerant crops or hurricane tolerant buildings and structures. And I think that is an entirely new space that is underexplored and has a lot of potential.
All right, awesome. And if anyone does want to get in touch with you about hiring, what's the best way to reach out to you, and where do they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Caleb Boyd, or find us at our website, www.moltenindustries.com.
All right, let's move on to the lightning round. What's something about you that most people wouldn't expect?
That I grew up on a ranch.
Did you always want to be a founder or a VC or an engineer? Were there other very different career paths that you were drawn to? And if so, what were those?
When I was really young, my parents said I would have made a great lawyer because I liked arguing so much, but I was never drawn to it, really.
All right. Were you drawn to engineering from a young age? Was that...
I was drawn to engineering from a pretty young age, liked playing with Legos and building things, and yeah.
What do you think? I mean, not many people grew up on a ranch and became, went on to PhDs in engineering. I think these days, I could be wrong, but what do you think? Do you think that gave you any kind of unique insights or kind of perspective that's shaped how you've pursued things?
Absolutely. So, two things that I think have been really important out of that. One, growing up around a lot of people who are not like a lot of people that I've been around for maybe the last 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area or in Munich, Germany, or in India, has made me appreciate kind of the diversity of potential customers and people that when you're making a solution as a founder, you need to be able to cater to, and just being able to respect those perspectives and diversity of opinions. And then the other one is just hard work. I think I did a lot of hard work.
Do you hold a view on something that most people don't agree with you about? And if so, what is that?
I think this is particular to the climate tech space, but both Kevin and I have a view that electricity will get cheaper to a certain extent, but it's not going to become free or incredibly cheap anytime soon. And I think a lot of other climate tech founders would potentially disagree with us about that. But yeah.
What's some advice that you would give to your younger self?
Going back to the other thing I said, I think everything around us was made or invented or built by just a normal person like you or me.
What would you tell your younger self about that?
I think just to do more things and think about the doing them a little bit less. I think there were things, for example, when I was an undergrad, where I was like, wow, this seems really difficult, and I'm just going to let the experts take care of this problem, instead of taking time to go and try to figure that out myself, or taking time to go try to fix that myself. And I think sometimes the difference or the delta between you and the experts is not as great as you would think. So sometimes it is. I mean, nuclear fusion, pretty intense, but hey, if you have a great idea for nuclear fusion, maybe it'll work.
Why do you think that delta is not so great? Is it because the people we idolize or we put on a pedestal are not so spectacularly different than ourselves in terms of intellect, maybe? Or is it does it come down to something else, like just focus or amount of work you're willing to put into something? Or what's
both of those
the
are
difference?
huge. I think focus and the amount of work you're willing to put into something are huge. And a lot of the experts in spaces, a lot of times they're extremely busy people that are doing a lot of things other than learning or building about whatever they're doing, because they've kind of achieved the point where they can be famous and do podcasts and stuff like this. I think more specifically, when you look at just the level of information that's available to us on the internet these days, and then the level of people that are available to us on the internet these days, like the people you can reach out to on LinkedIn or Twitter, is wild. And the feedback that you can get on an idea that was just not available, even 20 years ago, we're at a time like no other in history where information is readily available, that is cutting edge, that is the same information that's available to all the experts in the space. And then all those experts in the space are similarly relatively available. And so a lot of people will just ignore your LinkedIn messages or whatever, but maybe one of them will bite, and that's a great opportunity.
Caleb, last question. When you're gone from this earth, what would you like to be remembered for?
Well, being a great husband and hopefully contributing something to climate change and being a great friend.
All right. It's been really great to have you on the program. I'm so excited to see what Molten becomes. It's a really exciting space, and you guys are so impressive.
Thanks, Sasha. Really appreciate you having me. It's been a fun time. So.
All right.